This story takes place in the 1970s in sunny Santa Cruz, California, an otherwise peaceful coastal town that earned a dark nickname, the murder capital of the world. Why? Because three men, three serial killers, were all operating there at the same time. But today's story focuses on one of them, a man so unassuming that police officers even called him a gentle giant. His name, Edmund Kemper. The year is 1964, and we are deep in the rural quiet of North Fork, California. A 15-year-old boy named Edmund Kemper is spending the summer at his grandparents' ranch. But this isn't the kind of idyllic vacation you might imagine. It's more like a powder keg waiting to blow. And Edmund, a 6-foot-tall, socially awkward teenager, is the match. Ed is different. People avoid him, brush him off. He's smart. Genius-level smart, as tests later prove, but there's a darkness inside him. A darkness that started small, but has been steadily growing. By his own account, he was a walking time bomb. And on this one afternoon in August, the countdown finally hit 0. Edmund's grandparents, Maud and Edmund Sr., had agreed to let their troubled grandson stay with them. But Ed and his grandmother, Maud, clashed constantly. Maud had a habit of bossing Ed around, which reminded him all too much of his mother, Clarnell, a woman he would later describe as his greatest tormentor. Over time, his resentment for Maud simmered into something far worse. On August 27th, that simmer turned into a boil. It started with an argument in the kitchen, something trivial, something meaningless, but to Ed, it was the final straw. He grabbed a .22 caliber rifle, a gift from his grandfather, and ignored Maud's warning not to shoot at the birds outside. Instead, he turned the gun on her. 3 shots, 1 to the head, 2 to the back. The room fell silent. For a moment, Ed stood there, staring at what he'd done. But there was no panic, no running. Instead, he dragged Maud's body into a bedroom and sat down to wait. Minutes later, he heard a car pull up outside. It was Edmund Sr., his grandfather, returning home. Ed knew he couldn't let his grandfather see what he'd done. He raised the rifle again, and when his grandfather stepped out of the car, Ed pulled the trigger. Afterward, Ed moved the old man's body into the garage. He stood there in the sudden silence of the empty house, trying to figure out what to do next. With nowhere else to turn, he called his mother, Clarnell, who was living in Montana. "I did it," he told her flatly, and Clarnell, perhaps unsurprised, perhaps horrified, ordered him to call the police. Ed did as he was told. He waited calmly at the ranch gate until officers arrived. When they questioned him, he gave an answer that stunned them. He'd killed his grandmother to see what it felt like. As for his grandfather, he claimed he shot him out of mercy to spare the man from discovering what his grandson had done. The California courts didn't know what to make of Edmund Kemper. He was 15 years old, but his crimes? They were unthinkable. A psychiatric evaluation labeled him paranoid schizophrenic, and he was sent not to a juvenile detention center, but to a Atascadero State Hospital for the criminally insane. It was there that doctors discovered something even more disturbing. Ed wasn't just dangerous. He was brilliant. Tests placed his IQ near 140, just shy of genius-level intelligence. And while Edmund appeared to cooperate with treatment, his thoughts and his darkness never really went away. Over the next 5 years, Ed studied his fellow patients and the doctors who treated them. By all accounts, he was polite, articulate, and eager to learn. So, when he turned 21, his doctors believed he was rehabilitated. They released him into the world. But one critical recommendation was ignored. He should not live with his mother. It was a mistake that would cost 6 young women their lives. Edmund Kemper returned to Santa Cruz, a sleepy coastal city south of San Francisco, where he moved in with his mother, Clarnell. Santa Cruz, with its redwood forests and ocean views, looked like paradise. But there was a darkness lurking just beneath the surface. By the 1970s, the city was already on edge. The University of California had opened a new campus, bringing in an influx of young people, and not all the locals were happy about it. Then the murders began. In 1970, a man named John Linley Fraser broke into a doctor's home and murdered his entire family. His motive? He believed he was stopping scientific progress from destroying nature. Soon after, another killer appeared, Herbert Mullen, who claimed he was on a mission to prevent a massive earthquake by taking lives as sacrifices. By 1973, Mullen had been arrested and linked to 10 murders. And yet, even while Santa Cruz was still reeling, something even more sinister was unfolding in the background. Women had begun to disappear while hitchhiking, a common way for students to get around at the time. Some bodies were found, others weren't, and police were desperate to figure out who was responsible. This time, it wasn't Fraser. It wasn't Mullen. It was Edmund Kemper. When Ed had been released from Atascadero, he was a young man trying to find his place in the world. He attended community college and dreamed of becoming a police officer, but at 6'4", he was deemed too tall for the job. Instead, he hung around local police officers, earning their trust. They called him Big Ed and thought he was a harmless, polite guy. No one knew that while Ed smiled and listened to their stories, he was plotting. He bought a car, a yellow Ford Galaxy. He stocked the trunk with plastic bags, knives, a blanket, and handcuffs. Then he started picking up hitchhikers. For a while, Ed played it cool, giving lifts to over 100 women without harming them. But this was all part of his plan, a way to build trust, to perfect his approach. Finally, in May 1972, Ed made his move. 2 young women, Marianne Pesse and Anita Lucchesa, were hitchhiking to Stanford University when Ed pulled up. They climbed into his car and vanished. Days later, pieces of Marianne's remains were found in the mountains. Anita's body was never recovered. The disappearances escalated. Over the next year, more young women went missing. Aiko Koo, Cindy Shaw, Rosalind Thorpe, and Alice Liu. The brutal details of their fates led the media to nickname the killer the Co-Ed Killer. But the city of Santa Cruz had no idea who they were really dealing with. The polite, intelligent man they knew as Big Ed was only getting started. In the early 1970s, authorities were perplexed by a string of unsolved murders and missing women in the San Mateo County area. The details of the crimes suggested the killer wasn't an amateur. The beheadings and dismemberments were executed with chilling precision, likely by someone with professional knowledge. The victims' bodies were positioned at a specific angle, allowing the blood to drain, making dismemberment easier. It became clear that at least one of the victims had been held captive before her death. One victim, Cynthia Scholl, even had her Achilles tendon severed. Then, on March 4th, 1973, 2 hitchhikers stumbled upon a human skull and jawbone not far from Highway 1. Police soon found another skull matching the jawbone, confirming that they were victims killed close together. After reviewing missing person reports, they identified the remains as Rosalind Thorpe and Alice Liu. Liu had been shot twice in the head and Thorpe once, but even as police began piecing together the clues, the situation grew even more perplexing. The killer, who had been targeting young women, unexpectedly contacted the police. On April 23, 1973, the Santa Cruz Police Department received a call they could hardly believe. The call came from a phone booth in Pueblo, Colorado, from a man they knew well. Edmund Kemper, a 24-year-old man, had been spending hours chatting with the officers, having drinks and meals with them. Now, he confessed to a series of murders. He began by admitting to the recent killing of his mother, Clarnell Strandberg, on Good Friday. He had then gone out drinking with local police officers. Later, he returned home and invited his mother's friend, Sarah Hallett, to dinner. He murdered her, beheaded her, and stuffed both bodies into closets in his mother's house. Kemper continued, revealing a horrifying list of other murders, including several female college students. But when the officers on the line initially dismissed his confession as a prank, Kemper persisted. He called back, trying to convince them to take him seriously, even mentioning a police officer named Sergeant Alafi, who had recently confiscated one of his guns. Finally, one officer agreed to check his mother's house. When Sergeant Alufi arrived at the scene, he was struck by the overwhelming smell of decay. Upon opening a closet, he discovered blood and hair, which immediately prompted him to secure the area and call in detectives. To their horror, they found the bodies exactly as Kemper had described. Both women were decapitated, and Clarnell's body had been horribly mutilated, her tongue and larynx cut out and discarded in the trash. The discovery led detectives to a chilling realization. The college girl killer had been eluding them for so long because he was deeply familiar with their investigation tactics. He had been playing them for years, using his calm and unassuming demeanor to gain the trust of the very people trying to catch him. Edmund Kemper's chilling story didn't end there. A team of detectives traveled across multiple states to apprehend him, finding him eerily calm and willing to cooperate. In a detailed confession, he admitted to the murders of 6 young women, his mother, her friend, and even his grandparents, bringing his total to 10 murders. He led investigators to where he had buried or disposed of his victims' remains, adding even more gruesome details to his account. During the trial, the extent of Kemper's twisted fantasies was revealed in disturbing detail. A warning before we continue: the details ahead are graphic and disturbing, diving deeper into Kemper's brutal crimes. Out of respect for the victims, we've spared you some of the more harrowing details, but what you'll hear next is not for the faint of heart. If you're not sure you can handle it, now's the time to step away. For those who are staying and have been following this horrifying story, please consider liking and subscribing to support the channel. Now, let's continue with the horrifying reality of these crimes. Born on December 18, 1948, in Burbank, California, Edmund Kemper's childhood was marked by trauma. His parents' divorce, when he was just 9 years old, deeply affected him. He was sent to live with his mother, Clarnell, in Montana, and there he was often subjected to cruel treatment. His mother would lock him in the basement, criticizing him for his perceived failures and emasculating him. This torment led to a deep resentment and hatred of his mother, which would later manifest in his crimes. As a child, Kemper exhibited disturbing behaviors. He killed family pets, including the family cat, and displayed a fascination with death and violence. By the time he was a teenager, his thoughts turned to sexual fantasies, and he began to act on these disturbing urges. At 13, he killed his own cat with a machete. This early violence set the stage for his future crimes. At age 15, Kemper was sent to live with his father, who was remarried and uninterested in having his son around. After a brief stay, he was sent back to his mother. By then, Clarnell's constant criticism had instilled a deep sense of failure and anger in him. He developed a twisted obsession with women, particularly college students, whom his mother had forbidden him from dating. This anger festered, and he began to target young women, luring them into his car with promises of a ride. On May 7, 1972, Kemper's killing spree began in earnest. He picked up 2 college students, Marianne Pesch and Anita Lucchesa, intending only to sexually assault them, but when they resisted, he killed them to prevent them from being witnesses. He drove their bodies back to his apartment, where he took photographs of their dismemberment and engaged in disturbing acts with their remains. He buried one of the victims in a shallow grave, and the other he disposed of in a nearby gorge. For months, Kemper continued his killing spree, carefully planning each murder and becoming more brazen with each victim. On September 14, 1972, he picked up his next victim, Aiko Koo. After a brief encounter in his car, he killed her and dumped her body in the trunk. Just a day later, Kemper appeared before a panel of psychiatrists as part of his parole hearing. He convinced them that he was no longer a threat, and they recommended that his juvenile delinquency record be sealed. He was released from custody, and the killing continued. His confidence grew with each murder, and by January 7, 1973, he was ready to strike again. This time, he picked up Cindy Scholl, a hitchhiker, and murdered her in a secluded area. He took her body back to his mother's house, where he cut it up in the bathtub. He buried the head in the backyard, and the body parts washed up on a nearby beach. As he killed more women, Kemper's mother remained a constant source of frustration and anger. He knew that she would eventually discover the souvenirs he had kept from his victims. Her control over him was suffocating, and in his mind, she was the one thing standing between him and total power. One night, after a heated argument, Kemper took matters into his own hands. He waited until his mother went to bed, then entered her room and violently attacked her, ultimately taking her life and decapitating her. He then invited her friend Sally Hallett over, where he strangled her and placed her body in his bed. He spent the night with the two bodies, and his actions became even more disturbing, as he engaged with them inappropriately. When Kemper reached Pueblo, Colorado, he called the police and gave them detailed directions to his mother's house, making it clear that he wanted to be caught. The police finally arrived at the scene and confirmed his confession. By May 7, 1973, he was charged with 8 counts of first-degree murder. His defense attorney attempted to have him plead insanity, but Kemper's intelligence and carefully planned murders made it difficult to argue that he was mentally ill. The trial lasted several weeks, and on November 8, 1973, a jury found him sane and guilty. Although the jury recommended the death penalty, a Supreme Court ruling meant that Kemper was sentenced to life in prison. Throughout his time in prison, Kemper was evaluated numerous times. He even requested psychosurgery, but his request was denied. Though he became a model prisoner, his eerie calmness continued to disturb those around him. FBI Special Agents John Douglas and Robert Ressler joined the Behavioral Analysis Unit at Quantico in the early 1970s, at the dawn of its creation. At one point, they had the idea of visiting prisons and interviewing notorious murderers. They would incorporate this information into a database of the behaviors and characteristics of known killers, which would become the backbone of their training. The two agents contacted a variety of criminals, including mass murderers, contract killers, and serial killers, collecting data on 118 victims. Their goal was to gather information about how the murders were planned and carried out, what the killers did and thought afterward, their fantasies, and their activities leading up to the crime. Edmund Kemper was among the 36 men who agreed to be interviewed, and Robert Ressler has a chilling story about the encounter. Kemper made his move at the end of his third interview with Ressler. The profiler had been accompanied on his 2 previous visits, but since he felt he had already established a rapport with Kemper, he decided to go it alone this time. The two spent 4 hours in a small, locked cell on death row. Towards the end of the conversation, Ressler pressed the button to summon a guard, but no one came. He continued talking, pressing the button again, but still no one responded. Kemper, sensing his growing anxiety, told him to calm down, then casually remarked, "If I went apeshit in here, you'd be in a lot of trouble, wouldn't you? I could screw your head off and place it on the table to greet the guard." Followed by, "What could they do? Cut off my TV privileges?" Ressler tried to buy time by pretending he had a way to defend himself. Finally, the guard appeared, and Kemper, seemingly amused, claimed he was just joking. But from that moment on, Ressler never entered Kemper's cell without an escort. In 2017, Ed Kemper was denied parole. His next appearance before the parole board in Santa Cruz was set for 2024, but it came as no surprise when he was denied again. He is next eligible in 2031, when he will be at the age of 83. And that's the story of Edmund Kemper, the so-called co-ed killer. What do you think of this? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you found this story unsettling yet fascinating, consider subscribing for more. I'll see you in the next one.